part of a series of talks, short talks about why it's so difficult for me and for many people outside to understand China and the Chinese. It's based on a book I wrote and published a little while ago called Understanding the Chinese, a personal A to Z. And in other talks I've talked about the difference between the Western individualistic attitude and the Chinese group-based attitude, differences in law, differences in religion. Here I want to talk about some other reasons why I think it's very difficult for me to grasp hold of China, despite having been there 17 times. One of them is the sheer size. I come from a small country, England, or Great Britain even, a tiny country, which, even if it was a bit bigger, like France or Germany, would fit into one Chinese province, into Yunnan or Sichuan or one or two of the bigger provinces. So, and there are 50 odd provinces, or perhaps less, but a number of provinces in China. So you have to imagine an entity which geographically spreads from, and in climate, spreads from Finland in the north down to Morocco in the south, from Portugal in the west across to Western Russia in the east, and with all those variations of climate from subtropical up to the fringe of the icy belt of the Arctic. And so its size totally is like the whole of Western Europe, the whole of Eastern Europe, much of Western China, and bits down into Turkey. Vast, vast. And obviously in terms of population, it's still probably, though India is overtaking it, with 1.4 billion people, much bigger than Western Europe, for example. So you're dealing not with a country or a nation, you're dealing with a continent, and a vast one at that. And so any generalization you make about one part of it is probably going to be untrue about other parts of it. And the history and culture of different parts, the differences of languages between the Mandarin-speaking north and the languages of the south, the differences of the diets, vast differences, difficult to comprehend. If you add to that huge difference between my world and that world, the vast history of China. My country I think of as an old country because it has a continuous history from Anglo-Saxon times, shall we say, from King Alfred and the unification of England in the 8th, 9th century through to now. So 1200 years of history seems a long time, and Japan is roughly the same length of time. China, in many ways, can be seen as a civilization which has remained China and Chinese in its essence for 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years, 5 times as long. And certainly in terms of its governmental structure and its basic features, since its unification, which was 221 years before the birth of Christ by the Qin Emperor. So you got at least 2,200 years of continuous Chinese history. Of course, it's been attacked and altered, and it's constantly modifying itself, but it is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, and that's so very different from what I have experienced here. And in terms of that ecology, geography, and history, another great difference is in its crops and ecology. Being so huge, the climate and soil changes immensely over vast distances. And so basically the north and the south are different kinds of agricultural system, the south being rice producing and the north being hard grains, wheat and barley and other grains like that. And so you really have to understand that the social structure and everything else about those two great regions in China are different. And there's nothing like that on that scale in my experience, although of course England and Scotland have different basic grains and different climates to a little extent, but it's just a tiny example of something which is huge in China. And indeed the vast difference of the ecology and geography can be seen in the basic materials that the two civilizations, mine and China, use. Mine is basically a hard grains, wheat and maize and such things which have to be ground. China is certainly in the south the soft grains of rice. Mine is based on iron in its military and many other uses, an iron civilization. China is a bamboo civilization. Much is made out of this pliant and supple bamboo. I'm from a cloth, sheep civilization. China is a silk and cotton civilization. So the materials that constitute my life, including stone as opposed to wood and paper in China, all these things which invisibly shape our worlds without us knowing, are totally different. So those are a number of the features. Another one is something which historians have called the difference between fat and thin civilizations. What they mean is that in a thin civilization, the people live on the margin or just above subsistence. They are thin physically, as the Chinese are, if you've met them on the whole, because for century after century, the agriculture and the population were in a certain balance, which meant that people really had to eat extremely simply, live extremely simply, and frequently there were epidemics or disturbances, and there would be mass famines. It's been reckoned that China, for 2,000 years, there were famines in one or other part of China every year over 2,000 years, whereas in my country, England, the last national famine was almost exactly 700 years ago. So I live in a country which, as a historian who studied it, is extremely fat. If you go back to medieval times in England, you see that people eat a lot of meat, drink a lot of milk, butter, cheese, bread. They eat well. They eat as well as we do. Their clothes are really good, made from animal products. Their houses, I live in a 17th century house, but there are many medieval houses which are really well built and comfortable and large. So in every aspect, I come from a country which has not faced the periodic disasters that China has faced. Right up in the last great famine, of course, was that caused by the great leap forward of Chairman Mao in the late 1950s, when millions and millions of people died. So China still remembers living in a thin civilization. And the Chinese themselves, until 35, 40 years ago, lived on the brink, on the edge of destitution. one of the enormous achievements, one of the greatest achievements in modern history, has been the way in which the Chinese have raised something like 800 million, the total population of Western Europe plus, out of poverty, as defined by the United Nations, into modest affluence, where people can eat and live decently. And the Chinese consider this one of their great achievements and a part of human rights, to live without fear of starvation and disease. And China has done that. But it's only very recently. So China's history is within a Malthusian world where population builds up and then there's some disaster, some civil war, some invasion, some flood or loss of rain, and millions starve to death. That's a recurrent passage of a thin civilization, and so their attitude to life is really one of facing struggle and making ends meet in a way that mine is not at all. So in all these respects, I find trying to get my mind round an entity which is so very different in its material, demographic, social, ecological, geographical, historical perspectives is really difficult, but also essential, because China is part of our world, we are part of their world, and we have to understand each other and our different backgrounds and histories. Thank you.